and I want you to play the chorus of that song. And if there's a way we can play this so the listeners can hear it, so I can hear it in the background. Somebody's got it in the background. So do you hear that right
it's
there?
Like disco.
Oh, it's like Pitbull. Is what it's like.
Oh, it's for like a dance track.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's like in Miami. It's like how they listen to Bad in Miami.
Yeah.
Yeah. Imagine Bad, but then like the beat drops and it's like, you know that thing where the sound goes like it's worldwide. It's basically a Pitbull. I'm like, this doesn't need to exist, but it didn't stop me from getting joy.
Let's be honest, most bonus like albums and tracks and stuff don't need to exist.
But
it's just for the super fan.
The second album of Bad on this was a fascinating listen, guys. So like I'm not going to recommend it, but boy, it's an interesting. I don't know when these songs were recorded. I don't know if they were part of that stuff that Josh was talking about, like Captain EO and
Wikipedia says it's demo recordings recorded during the Bad era.
During the Bad era, okay,
Yeah.
It is an interesting slice of life, and there's some pretty good songs on that. There's a song called Streetwalker on it that's very good. But once again, Michael Jackson has an interesting. He is very paranoid, lyrically, and the songs like "The Price of Fame" and "Al Capone" and that song called "Abortion Papers" and I'm like, boy, he really. He was already, you know what I mean? Like the things were closing in on him a little bit, so it's kind of sad that way. But yeah, if you have time, I would definitely say check it out.
Another funny thing about this record, I was just listening to it earlier tonight with Sherry, and we were both commenting on like the song "Bad" itself, because I think that was the huge when it came out.
Yeah,
that was the lead thing, and then that song definitely like faded in the background once the other songs kind of came out, because it's definitely not as good as some of those. It's still good, but it's not as good as those other ones. But it's really funny. Like he's talking about how bad he is in the chorus in the background, really, really bad, and we're like, he doesn't sound bad at all. Like, he's very it's a very light-hearted bad that I don't know. It just it did the juxtaposition there doesn't really fit what the sound of the song was. So
well, always
it's still a damn good song though.
It is.
Yeah.
I mean, he's always trying to be. Again, it's like you can't be too bad when Beat It is like a West Side Story parody.
Well, even the way you make me feel, right? He's like stalking that beautiful girl, but he's like climbing on cars and dancing, and famously in the video, and it's like, so he's ominous, but he's not. Even Thriller, right, has an ominous nature, but in a Michael Jackson way. So, but thumbs up across the board. It sounds like.
Yeah.
Well,
for sure.
I can't think of a transition that's going to be more different than going from Michael Jackson to Arthur Russell, guys. I don't know if we can go in a more direction. And something tells me, Matt, you were not listening to this album with Sherry in the same way that you did Michael Jackson. Band.
I don't know if I listened to this album anyway that I've listened to other albums.
Well, run the numbers and you get the first take, so go for it.
All right, so World of Echo by Arthur Russell comes in at number 263 in the 1980s on Best Ever Albums. Number 22 in 1986, number 1,682 of all time. It is Arthur Russell's highest rated album on Best Ever Albums, and it's not on Rolling Stone's list, and he is ranked number 1,055 of overall artist rankings. What list? Do you remember what list you got this from, John? Before I
Pitchfork, my friends.
This is on Pitchfork.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So I think we have another album here that's. I don't really consider this music. This is like this is art. This is art on wax,
Art on wax. That's what you should call your debut album. Art on wax.
This to me, it sounds like avant-garde Nick Drake is what
oh my
I was
God,
kind of getting
that's what
from
I wrote
this.
down.
Yeah, it's what it is. I mean, so it sounds like it's a cello guy, right? The guy's playing the cello, and he uses effects on the cello. It's kind of electronic, like he's kind of got like an electronic cello vibe going on. And then he does this. He's got this. I don't know how you would describe his voice. I can't pick out the words that he's saying. He's kind of, it's a very drony record. It's a very, kind of.
He kind of sounds like Nick Drake too, in my
Right, yeah, and that's kind of, so it's kind of got this somber, sad kind of like undertones with it. I can't really, it was a hard listen because it's just like one song after the other that's very similar. Obviously there's differences in the songs, but the tone is very similar. He seems like a very not a happy guy, as very much like Nick Drake, and it strikes me as being an album that probably resonated with a lot of like artists, and other musicians that maybe took some of what he did with some of the sonic effects that he was using with the cello. I mean, it sounded kind of cool. Like it's like that's kind of a cool sound. Like I did like that, but what he was doing with it, which was just almost like just slapping the bow on the cello, not really having a ton of structure to it, just kind of creating these sound effects. Maybe it resonated with a lot of people. It didn't really do much for me. I think I got through this twice and I was like, I got it. Some of these records, I listened to them like, okay, I think this is something I might need several listens to get into a little bit more. And that certainly has happened before, but this was pretty clear early on, in the week that I don't know how many listens I could get to this. It's not going to be something that ever really connects with me. Maybe I could see if somebody wanted to put one of these songs on a playlist or a mix or something, is like, hey, this is kind of a cool sounding thing. All right, I could get down with that. Put 3 minutes of this on it and then move on. But a whole record, it's not for me. This is like a Residence record where it's kind of like, it's not necessarily soundscapes, but it's just to me, it's not really, it's not music. It's more of an art project,
Yeah.
So I gotta go personally, thumbs down. I would not go back to this. And I don't think that I need to recommend this to anybody to like, oh, you got to go back and listen to this. It's, maybe a song, check out the first 2 songs and then you can move on. Cause to me, it's the entirety of the record is very kind of hitting that note. So, not for me, I don't think.
Yeah. Interesting. I was browsing through Wikipedia briefly. Anyway, so yeah, it is definitely kind of like an experimental art rock album. This is definitely an album you should listen to on headphones, or
absolutely,
or at least like really good speakers, I guess, because he plays a lot with kind of where the sound comes from. It kind of switches ears at times. It fades in and out. He comes real up front with it. It's a very, in some ways, it feels like a very DIY type of album with like low production, maybe not low production, but like, he's controlling everything, I think, or, maybe he did it in his garage or something like that. That's kind of the feel I get from it. Matt's right. The cello is kind of his instrument, and that's the primary driver of the music. It's a very kind of simplistic album in some ways, but it's definitely like also electronic, and he's messing with, I don't know. There's some incorporation of kind of like noise as well, slightly, and some like African sounding beats or music on a song like Wax the Van. You can also hear him in terms of production, like calling out to somebody to jump in, or somebody else is saying jump in at times too, which I thought was interesting. It's not like any sort of traditional album. It's definitely in that soundscape, experimental, avant-garde section of artists that we've listened to in the 70s and 80s. And the other interesting, that song All Boy All Girl, it really kind of reminded me of like Band of Horses for some reason. Maybe the way he sings it or something. It reminded me of that song from A Ghost Story that that band features in. So I did for some reason I found this more interesting than the Talk Talk album. I was like, this is at least keeping my attention, and there's interesting things going on, and so it's thumbs in the middle from me, but it's definitely different and it's different from the other kind of avant-garde experimental albums that we've listened to as well. So we haven't really listened to anything with the features the cello prominently, which I thought was interesting. And I think there's, would I want to listen to a whole album of this again? No, but I could see a track here or there coming up that might be interesting. This is kind of an atmospheric album as well, like the Talk Talk album. I think you have to be in the right mindset to want to listen to this, or it's not even an ambient album in that you could like put it on in the background, and you kind of have to like dial into it in some way.
I could see this, like in the background. I could see people like you can't ignore this, I think people could very much get like, all right, what is this, but I think you're right, Josh. You probably have to be, if you're going to listen to it, it's kind of a more intent listen.
Yeah, and it's like we said Nick Drake, and he's kind of like a singer-songwriter, but through like a, I don't know, DIY experimental lens. Whereas Nick Drake was kind of more folky pop, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
This is more, I don't know, not even jazz inspired, but some sort of fusion of something. So interesting listen for sure. What do you think, John?
Yeah, I mean, it became evident very quickly that I was going to be both analyzing and processing this album as Matt said, not traditional pop music, right? So it immediately joined luminaries such as Laurie Anderson and Captain Beefheart and The Residents and Throbbing Gristle, right? And it may be less Throbbing Gristle in the pop group that were deconstructed too, but definitely The Residents, Laurie Anderson, and some of what Captain Beefheart was doing, where it's like, I don't know if also like a little bit of what like some of the early krautrock was, right, where it sounds and not necessarily tied to melodies. So from that end of things, I just pivoted, right? You know what I mean? It's like, okay, let me, and when I listen to albums like that, I listen and go, is the sounds they're making, or is another group in that sometimes, like
definitely is ambient, or
not as much the ones we covered, but like certainly stuff like the airport stuff that's there. And so then how I analyze it is the stuff that they're doing interesting, and I also immediately grab my headphones because, like I said, I've been doing something where I listen to one headphones and one non-headphones, and I'm like, yeah, there is absolutely no way that I'm going to get anything out of this album if I'm not listening on headphones, because like that's just, to me, it's a necessity for these type of sound-based albums, right? Like found sounds and stuff. The thing that jumped out to me immediately, outside of some of the things you mentioned, the use of the cello and stuff that you guys didn't mention, is the interesting mix of reverb. Like this album was like if somebody said, let's do an entire album on reverb and echo and just let that effect go. Now it comes out as distortion at times, but like definitely the overriding facet of this album to me is the reverb nature of it, which causes that sound like it's like he's singing kind of in like a bubble would be the best way I would describe it, and the sound feels like it's trapped.
I thought I pictured him being in like a small room right in front of the speaker playing the cello.
Right, yeah, or like a bubble of some sort, and it's like he's singing out to the world, but like his message is being sort of filtered, like in a way where the frequency, the reverb gives it, I think, that feeling that you guys got of the sadness that you're hearing, and why the Nick Drake thing I totally understand, because it sounds like it could be Nick Drake singing like out and doing it. But the lyrics themselves are not really sad. They're more existential. So it has a little bit more of like a calling from the wilderness type feel to it. And in that way, it reminds me a lot, not musically, Matt, but it reminds me in spareness of like stuff that like people like Bon Iver and like Animal Collective and stuff were doing later, in terms of like the vibe of the music, right? But then it also has a total avant-garde nature, where like this is designed to be challenging. It's designed to be sort of an art project. It's not designed for mass consumption. As I've said before, with all of these albums, I always feel like there is a piece of DNA that musicians have that I don't know if I will ever have. It doesn't stop me from getting like a lot of it, but there's just that piece where I feel like I will never process albums like this because I don't hear sounds in the way you have to hear sounds to greatly appreciate this. And it's also the entry point of challenge is much higher to me than stuff that just simply uses a little bit of reverb or distortion, right? And even it does a different thing than some of those late 70s, early 80s avant-garde challenging music does, because this doesn't challenge you in a way that confronts you, right? It more just sort of confounds you, I think would be a better way to describe it. So I like, it's very hard for me to give thumbs up, thumbs down, or thumbs in the middle on these types of albums, because to me, it's like I experience them. And it's like, okay, that is new sounds that I've now added to my palette. And so I take them in kind of, and I don't really process them as like popular music to be evaluated, right? This is more just like, I've now been exposed to new sounds and new recording techniques. Thank you for doing that. And now I'll see if any of these sounds revisit my life. And so like from that end of things, it certainly didn't, I didn't have a hostile reaction to it, but, and there was stuff in the headphones that was interesting. And at times his voice gets pretty, even though it's distorted. But then it disappears out of it. And I know that someone, when I was doing the research afterwards, described it as like that his voice was duetting with the cello, which as I think back on it, I'm like, yeah, I kind of get that. You know, it's very spare, but at the same time, it is kind of like he and the cello are duetting at times.
It's like it's like you're hearing the echo of pop music too. Like he dances into like a melody or something, and then it like goes away. Or like, I can't stress enough like how much the headphone experience kind of like plays with your sound and the echo and stuff like that. It certainly lives up to
like
the title.
In a parallel universe, he's a singer-songwriter, right? Like strumming like a guitar. I guess it's cello in this case, but you know, you could just as easily see him doing the Nick Drake thing, right? Like spare arrangements where he's a singer-songwriter, and probably his voice is relatively pleasant or pleasant within the context, but like it's almost like it's like, all right, let me take that vibe and now do it on a more challenging instrument, right? Or I guess he would probably say deeper tenor, right? That allows for more reverb because at that frequency, right? Like you're down deep. And I guess, you know, it's called World of Echo, right? And it's well named because it is the echo and reverb effect is the number one thing that's the takeaway on this. So if you like experimental music or you like to have newfound sounds, this is worth your time for sure.
Yeah, I ended up, you know, almost immediately treating it like an academic type of listening experience also.
Intellectualized, yes.
Yeah.
You have to.
It has to be. Yeah,
right.
You have to, yeah. And I know, Matt, that is a difficult thing for you to do, right? You've famously shared that.
I could have tried harder this week because I think I listened to a little bit on headphones, but I didn't do an intent listen on headphones to be like, what can I piece together here, you know? And
then you're definitely missing some stuff, Matt.
Yeah, and I get that. I just to me, I don't know. And I could try better with that. And I think in some aspects with this podcast, I mean, going back to what we were talking earlier about how, you know, there's certain like deal breakers with certain genres that I'm like, I just can't do this, you know. This is as close as that gets to me because at least with like ska or with metal or with what was it like hardcore?
R&B is
like,
another one you don't.
Yeah,
like.
I mean, there's still elements of just traditional musical instruments and styles and, you know, structure or whatever that I'm like, okay, like it's familiar. When I get into something like this, it's like, okay, I don't know why I would ever try to. It's just a hard. It's like I said, I don't really consider this music. It's an experimental thing, and it's fine for what it is, right? And I absolutely believe there's a place for all forms of artistic expression, and you know, and a lot of times stuff like this leads to artists doing things that I love, and so I absolutely appreciate that. But at its core, am I gonna get any personal enjoyment out of this? Probably not. Like, it's not. It's just there's so much other stuff I'd rather do or listen to, or directions I'd rather go in. This is tough, and I don't know. Maybe at some point I could go. All right, now I'm in a headspace where I can put some headphones on and see if something else pops up, and that could happen, and maybe I would do that at some point. But generally speaking, man, my brain and my energy doesn't go in that direction. So it just makes it hard. It's a really large barrier to that entry point for me.
Yeah.
Okay. But you know who is a fan of this album and sampled this album on a 2016 album?
Who?
One Kanye West.
Oh, okay.
So
interesting.
Interesting. With his, as I could see hip hop, because they play around with echo and reverb quite a bit. Like, so it doesn't necessarily. It's funny. There's like the people involved in this album. There's Arthur Russell, and then the other people listed are a variety of people with producer credits and like remastering credits.